The master bedroom of the Meridian penthouse was drowning in the cold, gray silence of a San Francisco 3 a.m. Outside, the fog rolled over the Bay Bridge, swallowing the city whole. But inside the walk-in closet, Noah Taylor's world was being destroyed by the harsh, artificial glare of a 3-inch screen. It wasn't his phone. It was a cheap, untraceable device he had just pulled from the hidden lining of his wife's gym bag. As Kennedy slept soundly mere feet away, her chest rising and falling in innocent rhythm, the device vibrated in his palm. New message from B. I can still taste you from this afternoon. Leave him. If stories of shattered trust, silent fury, and the dark side of Silicon Valley well speak to you, stay with me. The fog rolling off the San Francisco Bay had a way of muffling the city, reducing the chaotic energy of millions of people into a heavy, suffocating silence. Inside the master suite of the Meridian, suspended 40 stories above the damp streets, the silence was absolute. Noah Taylor stood in the center of the expansive walk-in closet, the soft, ambient LED lights casting long, sharp shadows against the custom mahogany cabinetry. He was just looking for an Advil. A tension headache had been crawling up the base of his skull since the quarterly earnings call at Pemberton Tech that afternoon. Kennedy's leather gym bag had been left haphazardly on the ottoman, a rare moment of untidiness for a woman who curated her life with the precision of a museum director. When his hand slipped past the familiar fabric of her workout gear, his fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and entirely foreign. It was tucked deep into a zippered lining that Noah hadn't even known existed. He pulled it out. It was a phone. Not the sleek, titanium-cased iPhone 15 Pro they had both upgraded to last month. This was a generic black Android device, a burner, the kind of phone people bought with cash at corner stores when they didn't want a digital footprint. Noah stared at the cheap plastic casing, his pulse suddenly thick and sluggish in his ears. Why would Kennedy, the VP of Public Relations for a massive tech conglomerate, need a burner phone? As if answering the silent question, the plastic device vibrated violently against his palm. The screen blinked to life, throwing a harsh blue glare onto Noah's face. It bypassed a lock screen. She must have disabled it for quick access and displayed a notification banner directly over a blank, dark wallpaper. New message from B. I can still taste you from this afternoon. Leave him. The air in the closet vanished. Noah's lungs seized. He read the words again, and then a third time, waiting for his brain to process the English language into something that made sense, something that wasn't a catastrophic betrayal. But the letters remained stark and unforgiving. I can still taste you. A cold sweat broke out across Noah's collarbone. His thumb, trembling slightly, swiped down on the notification, opening the messaging app. There were no names, no saved contacts, just a single thread with a number he didn't recognize. He scrolled up. The text history stretched back for 4 months. It was an archive of destruction. There were coordinates for boutique hotels in Palo Alto, times for clandestine meetings while he was supposedly in board meetings, messages of raw, unfiltered desire that Kennedy had never, in their 7 years of marriage, directed at him. She called this man B her escape. She described her life with Noah as a gilded cage. Noah slowly lowered the phone. He walked out of the closet, moving like a ghost through the sprawling, minimalist bedroom. Kennedy was asleep on the California king bed, wrapped in silk sheets. Her blonde hair spilled across the pillows in perfect, effortless waves. She looked peaceful, untouchable. He stood at the foot of the bed, the burner phone clutched so tightly in his hand that the plastic creaked. This was the woman who had smiled at him over a glass of Cabernet just 3 hours ago, asking about his day. This was the woman who had kissed his cheek before turning off her bedside lamp. The urge to wake her, to scream, to throw the phone against the floor-to-ceiling windows and shatter the glass, flared hot in his chest. He wanted to see the terror in her eyes when she realized her perfect lie was over. He wanted to destroy her. But Noah Taylor was a man who built empires by controlling his impulses. He didn't react. He strategized. He looked down at the glowing screen one last time, the battery icon hovering at 12%. He memorized the number, carefully placed the phone back into the hidden compartment of the gym bag, and zipped it shut. The game had changed, and Kennedy didn't even know he was playing. Sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, a harsh, clinical brightness that stripped the San Francisco fog of its mystery and offered absolutely no warmth. Noah sat motionless at the edge of the sprawling Calicut marble kitchen island, an untouched cup of black coffee cooling rapidly in front of him. He had not slept a single second. The hours between 3 and 6 a.m. had been a slow, agonizing descent into a reality he no longer recognized. Every shadow in the luxury apartment had seemed to mock him. Every tick of the custom clock in the hallway, a rhythmic reminder of the hours she had spent with someone else. At exactly 7:15, the soft pad of bare feet against the heated hardwood floor announced Kennedy's arrival. She drifted into the kitchen, wrapped in a pale gray cashmere robe, her face scrubbed clean of makeup but still radiating that effortless, terrifying perfection. She smiled, a small, familiar curvature of the lips that Noah had once sworn belonged entirely to him. "Morning," she murmured, leaning over to press a brief, chaste kiss against his temple. She smelled of expensive vanilla lotion and mint toothpaste. Noah forced his facial muscles to remain entirely slack, swallowing the violent, acidic shudder that threatened to ripple through his chest. He didn't lean into her touch, but he didn't pull away either. He remained perfectly, horrifyingly still. "Morning," he replied, his voice a dry, measured rasp. Kennedy moved to the gleaming espresso machine, the intricate silver contraption whirring to life under her practiced touch. "You look exhausted. Were you up late thinking about the merger again?" "The stock price is holding steady, Noah. You need to let the legal team handle the final stress test." Noah watched her hands. They were steady as she poured steamed oat milk into a ceramic cup, creating a flawless fern pattern on the surface. These were the same hands that had typed those visceral, desperate messages to a stranger just hours ago. He searched her profile, hunting for a crack in the facade, a flicker of guilt, a heavy sigh that betrayed the weight of a double life. There was nothing. She was perfectly composed, an immaculate portrait of the supportive, high society tech executive wife. It was the absolute ease of her deception that chilled him to the marrow. If she could lie like this, with such mundane grace while casually discussing his company's stock, what else was a fabrication? Had the last 7 years been nothing but a masterclass in performance art? The woman making coffee in his kitchen wasn't his wife. She was a stranger wearing Kennedy's face. "Just running some projections," Noah lied smoothly, taking a slow sip of his bitter, lukewarm coffee. He found a dark, twisted satisfaction in matching her deceit. "Pemberton Tech is under a microscope right now. Everything needs to be flawless." "It will be," Kennedy said softly, taking the velvet upholstered stool across from him. She picked up her tablet, her eyes scanning the morning financial headlines. "You've built something incredible. No one can take that away from you." The dark irony of her words hung in the sterile morning air, invisible to her, but suffocating to him. She was right. He had built an empire. But the woman sitting 4 feet away had just casually detonated a bomb inside its foundational walls. Noah looked down at the marble surface, his analytical mind calculating the variables of this new, treacherous equation. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. Confrontation was messy, emotional, and unpredictable. He was a man of data. He needed to map the exact geography of her betrayal before he burned it all to the ground. "I have an early meeting with the board," Noah said, standing up and adjusting his silk tie with mechanical precision. "I'll be late tonight." Kennedy didn't look up from her screen. "All right. Have a good day. Love you." The words were a reflex, hollow and automated. Noah paused at the edge of the kitchen, the vast silence of the penthouse pressing in on him. "I'll see you later," he said, deliberately leaving the "love you" unspoken. For the first time in 7 years, he walked out of their home not as a husband, but as an investigator hunting a ghost. The glass walls of Noah's corner office at Pemberton Tech offered a panoramic view of the Silicon Valley sprawl, a sprawling grid of ambition, algorithms, and data. Today, however, he had drawn the electronic blinds, sealing himself in a soundproof tomb of his own making. The ambient hum of the server floors below was a familiar comfort, a rhythmic heartbeat he usually controlled with ease. On his massive curved monitor, he wasn't looking at the quarterly projections for the upcoming merger. He was staring at a blank, black command terminal. Noah had memorized the 10-digit number from the cheap Android device. As a top executive, his security clearance bypassed standard corporate firewalls. It was highly illegal, a blatant violation of federal privacy laws and company policy, to use Pemberton's proprietary geolocation tools for personal surveillance. But the man who cared about protocols had died at 3 in the morning on his closet floor. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the sharp clacking echoing in the quiet room. He fed the burner phone's number into a backdoor diagnostic network designed to track compromised corporate assets. He pressed enter. The screen blinked, processing the query, before a high-resolution map of the Bay Area materialized, blooming with tiny glowing red dots. This was the digital autopsy of his marriage. Each red coordinate was a timestamp betrayal. Noah zoomed in, his eyes scanning the data points with a detached clinical horror. He was drowning his agony in cold, hard metrics. Tuesday, 2 in the afternoon, a boutique hotel in Sausalito. Thursday, 8 at night, while he was delivering a keynote address at a charity gala, a high-end restaurant in the Marina District. The cluster of dots was dense, a constellation of lies stretching back over 4 months. He pulled up his personal phone and cross-referenced the dates with Kennedy's shared iCloud calendar. Her yoga retreat in Marin aligned perfectly with a 3-day stationary ping at a luxury resort down the coast. Her emergency PR crisis management block matched a 4-hour stay at a residential address in Pacific Heights. The precision of her deceit was staggering. She hadn't just slipped up, she had engineered a parallel existence with architectural brilliance. Noah leaned back in his leather ergonomic chair, the harsh light of the monitor washing over his pale face. He felt hollowed out, a vessel entirely emptied of grief and refilled with a freezing, calculated resolve. The data didn't lie. It didn't offer tearful excuses or manipulate his emotions. It simply presented the truth in stark, undeniable geometry. Kennedy was a ghost moving through his life, and these coordinates were her footprints. One specific location kept recurring with alarming frequency. It wasn't a hotel or a restaurant. It was a precise geographic coordinate nestled deep in the city, near an exclusive, notoriously discreet establishment. He highlighted the latitude and longitude, running a secondary search through public real estate and business registries. The address belonged to the Velvet Room, a highly exclusive private club known for its ironclad privacy policies and wealthy clientele. Noah stared at the glowing dot, a physical anchor to the phantom named B. The blinding urge to confront Kennedy had evaporated entirely, replaced by a darker, more potent obsession. Data was no longer enough. He needed to see this hidden world for himself. He needed to watch the lie in motion, to look at the man who was dismantling his life. Noah closed the terminal, wiping the search history from the mainframe with a single keystroke, and picked up his tailored suit jacket. The digital autopsy was complete. It was time for a physical observation. The entrance to the Velvet Room was an unmarked heavy oak door tucked into a fog-drenched alleyway off Battery Street. Noah handed the imposing doorman a black tungsten membership card, a corporate perk he had never bothered to utilize until tonight. The interior was a masterclass in calculated discretion. Thick velvet drapes absorbed the low hum of conversation, and the lighting was strictly limited to amber table lamps and the dull glow of a marble-topped bar. The air smelled of aged bourbon, expensive cologne, and secrets. Noah bypassed the hostess, slipping into a deep, crescent-shaped leather booth in the furthest corner of the lounge. He ordered a neat scotch, untouched, serving only as a prop for his camouflage. From the shadows, his vantage point offered a clear view of the VIP alcoves arranged along the opposite wall. At 8:15, Kennedy walked in. Noah felt a physical jolt in his chest, a sharp contraction of muscles as he watched his wife navigate the dimly lit room. She was wearing a sleek navy trench coat, the collar turned up against the San Francisco chill. But it wasn't her attire that caught his attention. It was her posture. The confident, commanding vice president of public relations was entirely absent. Instead, Kennedy moved with a rigid, hurried anxiety, her eyes darting toward the darkest corner booth before she quickly slid into it. Minutes later, a man approached her table. This was B, Blake Storm. Noah studied the architect of his ruined marriage with a predator's intense focus. Blake was conventionally handsome, dressed in a sharp, unstructured charcoal blazer, but there was a distinct arrogance in the way he carried himself, a languid, unapologetic swagger that belonged to a man who took things rather than earned them. Noah braced himself for the agonizing sight of a passionate reunion. He expected a lingering kiss, a gentle caress across the table, the sickening display of a romance his wife had craved outside their penthouse walls. But as Blake slid into the booth across from Kennedy, none of that happened. There was no smile on Kennedy's face. From his hidden vantage point, Noah watched her jaw clench tightly. Blake leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and spoke in a low, continuous murmur. Kennedy shook her head sharply, a jerky movement that betrayed a sudden spike of panic. She reached into her designer handbag, her movements frantic, but Blake's hand shot across the polished mahogany table, his fingers clamping down hard over her wrist. Noah stopped breathing. The glass of scotch in his hand hovered halfway to his mouth. It was a subtle gesture, invisible to the surrounding patrons engrossed in their own hushed conversations. But to a husband who had memorized his wife's every physical nuance for 7 years, it was a glaring siren. Kennedy didn't lean into his touch. She flinched. The muscles in her neck pulled taut, and her free hand gripped the edge of the table so fiercely her knuckles turned white. Blake's thumb stroked the inside of her wrist, a mocking imitation of a lover's caress, while his eyes remained locked on hers, cold and unrelenting. He was speaking again, the cadence of his jaw indicating a slow, deliberate threat. Kennedy's shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. In the shadows of his booth, Noah's purely vengeful fury began to mutate into something far colder and significantly more complex. The pristine, devastating narrative of a bored wife seeking a passionate affair shattered entirely. The woman sitting across the room wasn't intoxicated by love or blinded by lust. She was terrified. Noah placed his heavy crystal glass down on the table without making a sound. The equation he had been trying to solve since 3 a.m. had just fundamentally changed. Blake Storm wasn't just a lover, he was a captor, and Noah needed to know exactly what he was holding over her head. The Meridian penthouse was cloaked in the heavy, breathless quiet of 2 a.m. when Noah finally returned. He did not go to the master suite to check if Kennedy was sleeping. Instead, he walked silently into his private study, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind him with the finality of a vault. He bypassed the overhead lights, opting only for the sharp, concentrated beam of the brass desk lamp. Noah sank into his leather chair and placed his thumb against the biometric scanner of his secure personal laptop. The machine hummed to life. If the burner phone was the weapon of Kennedy's betrayal, the financial portfolios would be the battlefield. He needed to know exactly how much this hidden life was costing him. He skipped the domestic checking accounts and standard credit cards. Kennedy was too smart to leave a paper trail in the everyday expenses. Instead, Noah navigated through encrypted VPNs to access the offshore trusts and diversified liquidity reserves they had established in Zurich and the Cayman Islands shortly after Pemberton Tech went public. These were accounts meant to sit untouched, compounding quietly in the dark. His eyes scanned the ledger, fully expecting to find a trail of high-end indulgence. Unauthorized charges for private charters to Cabo, 6-figure Cartier bracelets, or exorbitant cash withdrawals for luxury hotels. What he found was far more clinical and infinitely more terrifying. There were no hotel bills. There were only wire transfers. Noah leaned closer to the screen, the pale blue light reflecting in his dark, unblinking eyes. On November 14th, exactly 4 months ago when the burner phone text began, a sum of $500,000 had been moved into a Delaware-based shell company. 6 weeks later, another transfer of $750,000 followed. By February, the bleeding had accelerated, with $1 million sliced into 3 separate transactions and routed through a labyrinth of dummy corporations. A total of $2.25 million had been quietly bled from their secondary reserves. Every single transaction had been authorized using Kennedy's secure digital signature. The numbers hovered on the screen, absolute and unfeeling. The puzzle pieces from the velvet room violently snapped together in Noah's mind. The rigid posture, the terror in his wife's eyes, the brutal, controlling grip Blake Storm had on her wrist. This was never a romance. This was a ransom. Kennedy wasn't paying for an upscale gigolo. She was trapped in a financial centrifuge, being bled dry by a predator. A sickening realization washed over Noah. His brilliant, sophisticated wife had made a fatal mistake, and instead of coming to him, she had tried to buy her way out of the trap using his empire's foundation. His hand hovered over the keyboard. The standard protocol for a CEO discovering financial fraud was immediate and decisive. One phone call to his private banker in Zurich would freeze the remaining assets. It would instantly cut off Blake Storm's supply line. But Noah's finger froze. The Pemberton Tech merger was entering its final, most fragile phase. A sudden, massive freeze on executive liquidity reserves, followed by the inevitable internal banking audit, would trigger red flags across the board. Wall Street algorithms would pick up the anomaly. The acquisition could stall, costing him billions and his position at the company. Furthermore, cutting off the money abruptly might force Blake to detonate whatever secret he was holding over Kennedy, turning a private extortion into a very public, very catastrophic scandal. Noah slowly closed the laptop, plunging the study back into semi-darkness. The betrayal had mutated. It was no longer a knife in his back. It was a bomb strapped to the chest of his life's work. He could not fight this as a wounded husband. He had to execute this as a wartime CEO. He needed counsel, someone who understood the mechanics of corporate destruction and possessed absolute moral flexibility. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a single name. The Sapphire Lounge did not open to the public until 4 in the afternoon. At 11 in the morning, the upscale establishment was a cavernous, empty echo chamber, smelling faintly of stale gin, expensive leather, and citrus wood polish. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains, casting long, muted streaks across the polished, mahogany bar. Noah sat at a corner booth, nursing a glass of sparkling water. Across from him sat Chris Baker, a senior partner at one of the city's most vicious corporate litigation firms, and the closest thing Noah had to a confidant. Chris was not a man built for empathy. He was an architect of legal destruction. Chris stared at the encrypted tablet Noah had slid across the table. For 3 full minutes, the only sound in the vast room was the soft, rhythmic tapping of Chris's manicured index finger against the edge of the screen as he scrolled through the offshore wire transfers. When Chris finally looked up, his expression was completely devoid of shock. It was the terrifying, sterile look of a surgeon evaluating a terminal tumor. $2.25 million in 4 months, Chris said, his voice flat, dropping the tablet onto the table. Routed through 3 dummy LLCs in Delaware before vanishing into crypto tumblers. She didn't just drain the secondary liquidity, Noah. She executed a professional-grade embezzlement. This isn't a marital dispute anymore. It's a federal crime. Noah kept his eyes on the condensation sliding down his glass. It's not embezzlement, it's extortion. I saw them last night at the Velvet Room. She's terrified of him, Chris. He's bleeding her dry. Chris leaned back, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. Does the motive actually matter? She stole from your shared reserves to pay off a blackmailer because she was sleeping with him. The narrative doesn't change the liability. My advice as your counsel, and as your friend, is to scorch the earth today. Chris reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek, silver pen, rolling it between his fingers. I can have an emergency injunction filed by 3 o'clock. We freeze every joint account, lock her out of the Meridian, and serve her with divorce papers before she finishes her afternoon Pilates class. We amputate the infected limb before the poison reaches Pemberton Tech. If we file the injunction, the bank triggers an automatic audit, Noah countered, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. The merger with Whitmore Capital is 12 days away. If Wall Street catches wind that my personal assets are frozen due to a massive, unexplained capital flight, the stock will plummet. The board will panic. I lose the acquisition. If you do nothing, you lose the money anyway, and this parasite keeps draining you until there's nothing left. Chris fired back, leaning over the table. You are thinking like a husband who wants to save his wife. You need to think like a CEO. I am thinking like a CEO, Noah said, his gaze finally snapping up to meet Chris's cold eyes. You're missing the most important variable in this equation. Chris narrowed his eyes. Which is? Kennedy is brilliant, Noah stated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. She manages crisis PR for a multi-billion-dollar tech firm. She knows how to bury scandals. She knows the legal ramifications of wire fraud. Yet she chose to risk federal prison and the destruction of our marriage rather than come to me for help. Noah leaned closer, the shadows of the lounge contouring the sharp, exhausted lines of his face. Whatever this man Blake Storm is holding over her, it's not just an affair. An affair is a divorce. An affair is an embarrassing headline. This? Noah tapped the glass of the tablet. This is a ransom. He has something nuclear. And if I cut the cord today, he detonates it. I need to know what the weapon is before I disarm the man holding it. Chris stared at him for a long, calculating moment. He slowly picked up the silver pen and slid it back into his jacket pocket. You're playing Russian roulette with the company, Chris warned softly. I know, Noah replied, staring at the blank screen of the tablet. But right now, I'm the only one who knows the gun is loaded. The air conditioning in Noah's private study hummed a low, monotonous drone, the only sound in the suffocating silence of Friday night. 3 rooms away, Kennedy was reading a novel in the master suite, entirely unaware that the digital architecture of her secret life had been entirely compromised. On Noah's desk sat a piece of proprietary, network-sniffing hardware, a sleek black box he had quietly removed from Pemberton Tech's cybersecurity lab that afternoon. It was synchronized to clone and intercept the cellular traffic of the burner phone hidden in her closet. At exactly 11:40, the black box emitted a single, soft pulse of green light. An incoming call. Noah exhaled slowly, a white-hot chill spreading through his veins. He picked up a pair of heavy, noise-canceling studio headphones and slipped them over his ears, plunging himself into a sensory void where only the digital frequency existed. For 3 agonizing seconds, there was only the faint, hissing static of a cheap cellular connection. Then the soft, trembling click of the line connecting. I told you not to call this late, Kennedy's voice whispered through the audio feed. It was a sound Noah had never heard in 7 years of marriage, a fragile, fractured tone, utterly stripped of her usual commanding poise. And I told you that the schedule is mine to dictate, Kenny. Blake Storm's voice slithered through the static. The languid arrogance Noah had observed at the Velvet Room was fully present in his cadence, but the faux romantic charm had completely dissolved. This was the voice of a predator who had his teeth firmly set in the neck of his prey. Noah closed his eyes, his grip on the edge of the mahogany desk, turning his knuckles to polished ivory. I can't authorize the next transfer, Kennedy pleaded, the desperation bleeding into a suppressed sob. The Zurich reserves are too low. It will trigger a secondary liquidity flag. Noah reviews the quarterly summaries next week. If I pull another million, he will know. I need more time. Time is a luxury you can no longer afford, Blake replied, his tone dropping an octave, settling into a cold, metallic threat. The Whitmore Capital acquisition goes public in less than 2 weeks. After that, the leverage changes. I want the final installment wired by Tuesday, or the insurance policy gets executed. Please, Blake, Kennedy begged, the sound of her breaking heart twisting a final, brutal knife in Noah's chest. Not because he pitied her, but because of the sheer pathetic nature of her surrender. I gave you $2 million. I gave you everything. You gave me a very entertaining afternoon in Sausalito, Blake corrected smoothly, the cruel smile almost audible over the line. And more importantly, you gave me a 30-minute audio recording of the vice president of Pemberton Tech casually disclosing the exact structural vulnerabilities and valuation metrics of the Whitmore merger while lying in my bed. Do you know what the SEC does to executives who leak corporate secrets to their lovers, Kenny? Do you know what the board will do to Noah when they find out his wife committed federal insider trading? Behind the desk, Noah stopped breathing. The oxygen was suddenly pulled from the room. I'll do it, Kennedy whispered, a defeated hollow shell of the woman he married. Tuesday. Just don't send him the tape. Don't destroy him. The line went dead. Noah sat frozen in the leather chair, the static returning to hiss venomously in his ears. He slowly removed the headphones, laying them gently on the desk. He didn't scream. He didn't throw the monitor. The revelation washed over him like a wave of liquid nitrogen, freezing every lingering ounce of love, anger, and grief into a solid block of absolute, terrifying clarity. Kennedy hadn't just broken their vows. She had weaponized his life's work. She had traded the keys to his empire for a cheap thrill in a hotel room, and now a serial extortionist held the detonator to Pemberton Tech. The investigation was officially over. It was time to go to war. The subterranean levels of Pemberton Tech's corporate headquarters were designed to withstand a seismic event, encased in thick reinforced concrete and isolated from the rest of the building. Deep within this fortress, inside a windowless, soundproof server monitoring room, the air was heavily climate-controlled and smelled faintly of ozone. It was Saturday morning. The campus above was empty, but Noah's war had just escalated. Sitting across from him at a steel utilitarian table was Elias, a former intelligence contractor who now operated as Pemberton's shadow director of corporate security. Elias did not deal in digital files or encrypted emails. He dealt in absolute tangible proof. He slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the cold metal surface. "Paper cannot be hacked, hijacked, or intercepted," Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly monotone. "You wanted the architecture of the man calling himself Blake Storm. You have it, but you are not going to like the structural integrity." Noah unclasped the envelope and spilled the contents onto the table. A dozen high-resolution surveillance photographs fanned out, accompanied by densely typed background checks, financial routing numbers, and redacted police reports. He stared at the face of the man who had infiltrated his marriage. Blake Storm is an alias, a synthetic identity constructed about 5 years ago, Elias explained, tapping a photograph of Blake sitting at a high-end cafe in a different city. "He is not a gigolo, Noah. He is a serial extortionist. A professional apex predator who specifically hunts in the high-altitude ecosystem of tech wealth." Noah picked up a file labeled Seattle 2021. The attached photo showed a striking brunette woman looking remarkably similar in style and social standing to Kennedy, the wife of a chief operating officer at a major cloud computing firm, Elias narrated, his tone clinical. She met Blake at a charity gala. 3 months later, a massive hemorrhage of offshore funds began. 6 months later, the audio of her detailing proprietary source code during a pillow talk session was sent to the SEC. The husband lost his position, the company's stock plummeted by 30%, and the wife suffered a complete psychological collapse. The money vanished into international crypto tumblers. Blake evaporated. Noah swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He set the file down and picked up the next one. Austin, 2023. The wife of a biotech billionaire. The exact same methodology. Seduction, extortion via corporate espionage, annihilation. "He doesn't target happy marriages," Elias continued, leaning back in his chair. "He profiles his victims for months. He looks for the wives of executives who are entirely consumed by their companies. Women who are deeply entrenched in the corporate structure, who have access to sensitive data, but who are emotionally starved and isolated. He finds the hairline fractures in the marriage and drives a wedge right through them." Noah stared blindly at the scattered papers, the harsh fluorescent lights of the server room buzzing faintly above him. A sickening, complex wave of emotion washed over him. The blinding rage he had felt toward Kennedy began to warp into a cold, heavy realization. Kennedy had not stumbled into a passionate, reckless affair. She had been hunted. Blake had studied Noah's schedule, mapped out his relentless focus on the Whitmore Capital merger, and calculated exactly how neglected Kennedy felt in the sprawling emptiness of the Meridian penthouse. He had tailored himself to be the perfect escape, entirely by design, only to snap the trap shut the moment she compromised Pemberton Tech. She was a traitor, yes. She had broken their vows and traded his empire for affection. But looking at the destroyed lives in the Seattle and Austin files, Noah felt a horrifying pang of pity for the woman he married. She was drowning in a current far too strong for her to swim against. "He is asking for the final transfer on Tuesday," Noah said quietly, his eyes fixed on Blake's photograph. "He promised to destroy the recording if she pays." "He won't," Elias stated flatly. "A parasite doesn't leave the host until it's completely dead. If you pay him, he will bleed you until the merger, and then he will sell the audio to your competitors anyway. That is his exit strategy." Noah slowly gathered the files, aligning the edges with meticulous, robotic precision. The equation was finally complete. There was no buying their way out, and there was no saving the marriage. But Noah Taylor was a builder of empires, and nobody burned down his city but him. "I need a secure location, entirely off the grid, for Tuesday evening," Noah commanded, his voice devoid of all warmth. "And I need everything you have on his physical vulnerabilities. We are not paying a ransom. We are laying a trap." Sunday evening draped itself over San Francisco in a bruised, violet twilight. Noah stood on the private terrace of the Meridian penthouse, the biting wind whipping at the lapels of his jacket. Below him, the city lights flickered to life like a vast electric motherboard. He held a glass of mineral water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal, a grounding sound in a world that had suddenly lost all gravity. Inside the living room, visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, Kennedy was curled up on the oversized linen sofa. She was reviewing digital press packets for the Whitmore Capital merger, the soft glow of her tablet illuminating the pale, strained lines of her face. From a distance, she looked like the epitome of high society grace. But Noah now saw the invisible wires strung around her neck, pulled taut by a predator in the shadows. The urge to slide open the glass door, walk into that pristine room, and shatter the illusion was a physical ache in his chest. He wanted to throw the dossier of Blake Storm onto the glass coffee table. He wanted to watch her eyes widen in absolute paralyzing terror when she realized her husband knew exactly what she had done and exactly who she had done it with. He wanted to demand how she could be so reckless, so profoundly naive, to hand the keys of Pemberton Tech to a professional extortionist for a few hours of stolen intimacy. But Noah Taylor did not become a titan of Silicon Valley by giving in to raw emotion. He won by mastering the cold calculus of survival. If he confronted her now, she would break. She was already fracturing under the weight of the $2 million she had bled from their accounts. A confrontation would lead to a confession, which would lead to an erratic, unpredictable breakdown. The board of Pemberton Tech was already monitoring his every move ahead of the acquisition. A sudden, explosive divorce involving federal wire fraud and corporate espionage would leak to the press within 24 hours. The stock would plummet. The Whitmore deal would collapse. Noah would lose the empire he had sacrificed his youth to build. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the icy water. He had to swallow the bitter, jagged pill of his own pride. For the next 48 hours, he had to play the role of the oblivious, overworked husband. He had to let Kennedy believe she was successfully managing the crisis, that Tuesday's final transfer would magically erase her sins and save their gilded cage. It was the most agonizing performance of his life. He stepped back inside, the warm, climate-controlled air of the penthouse washing over him. Kennedy glanced up from her tablet, offering that same small, familiar smile that now made Noah's stomach turn. "You're working late," she observed softly, setting the device down. "Is the Whitmore team pushing back on the valuation?" "Just final stress tests," Noah replied smoothly, walking over to the bar to set his glass down. He forced his shoulders to relax, carefully controlling the micro-expressions on his face. "We are in the home stretch. Once Tuesday is over, everything changes." Kennedy visibly relaxed, letting out a breath she had likely been holding all day, entirely misinterpreting his meaning. "I know. It's going to be fine, Noah." Noah looked at his wife, truly looking at the hollow, frightened woman trapped inside her own catastrophic deception. He felt nothing but a cold, vast emptiness where his love for her used to reside. "Yes," Noah agreed quietly, turning away so she couldn't see the glacial finality in his eyes. "On Tuesday, it all ends." Tuesday night brought a vicious Pacific storm that battered the jagged cliffs of Half Moon Bay. The secluded, glass-fronted rental house perched on the edge of the precipice was completely isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away down a winding, washed-out road. Inside the minimalist living room, the fire roared in the hearth, casting erratic, dancing shadows across the pale reclaimed wood floors. Kennedy stood shivering by the kitchen island, clutching her phone. She had just initiated the final wire transfer. The remaining $1 million was bleeding out of the Zurich liquidity reserves, vanishing into the digital ether. Across from her, Blake Storm poured himself a generous glass of vintage Cabernet, moving with the lazy, triumphant grace of a man who had just won the lottery. "It's done," Kennedy whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind, howling against the glass. "The money's routing. Now give me the flash drive with the audio file. It's over." Blake smiled, a slow, predatory curving of his lips. He took a sip of the wine, closing his eyes briefly to savor the vintage. "You know, Kenny, you really were one of my favorites. You have such a tragic, beautiful desperation about you. Give me the drive, Blake." The heavy oak front door opened and closed with a booming thud, followed immediately by the sharp metallic clack of the deadbolt sliding into place. Both Kennedy and Blake whipped around. Noah Taylor stood in the entryway. He was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat, perfectly dry despite the torrential rain outside, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the man holding the wineglass. He didn't look like a betrayed, heartbroken husband. He looked like an executioner stepping onto the scaffold. Kennedy took a step back, the blood draining from her face so fast she swayed. "Noah? What are you doing here?" Noah ignored her completely. He walked slowly into the center of the room, his footsteps echoing against the high-vaulted ceiling. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the cheap black Android device. He tossed it onto the kitchen island. It skidded across the smooth stone and stopped inches from Blake's hand. Then he reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew the thick manila envelope Elias had provided. He threw it down next to the phone. The photographs of Blake's previous victims in Seattle and Austin spilled out onto the counter, their terrified faces illuminated by the harsh pendant lights. "You have terrible digital security protocols, Mr. Storm," Noah said, his voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that cut right through the sound of the storm. "Or whatever your actual name is." Blake's smile vanished instantly. The languid arrogance evaporated, replaced by the rigid, calculated posture of a cornered animal. His eyes darted from the burner phone to the dossier, processing the catastrophic failure of his operation in real time. "Noah, please!" Kennedy choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes as her knees gave out. She slumped against the edge of the counter, gripping the marble for support. "I was trying to fix it. He was going to destroy the company. I was trying to protect you." Noah finally turned his gaze to his wife. There was no anger left in his expression, only a glacial, terrifying emptiness. "You didn't protect me, Kennedy. You traded the architecture of my life's work to a professional serial extortionist because you were bored with our marriage." He gestured toward the files. "You aren't a tragic heroine making a sacrifice. You are just his third mark on the West Coast." Blake set the wineglass down, subtly shifting his weight toward the heavy butcher block where a set of chef's knives rested. "You're a smart man, Taylor, but you're too late. The transfer is already in motion, and the audio file is set to auto-forward to the SEC and your board of directors if I don't check in by midnight." Noah didn't flinch. He just stared at Blake with absolute freezing authority. The room was sealed, the masks were gone, and the final negotiation was about to begin. Blake's hand hovered 3 inches from the heavy wooden knife block. The ambient hum of the refrigerator seemed to amplify in the tense, suffocating silence of the kitchen. Outside, rain lashed violently against the reinforced glass, but inside, the atmosphere had frozen completely. Noah did not reach for a weapon. He simply unbuttoned his charcoal overcoat with maddening slowness and checked the face of his platinum watch. "If you touch that knife, Blake, this goes from a white-collar financial dispute to an aggravated assault charge," Noah said, his voice entirely devoid of adrenaline. "And frankly, you are not built for federal prison." Blake scoffed, a nervous, jagged sound. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't risk the Whitmore merger. If I go down, the audio file goes to the SEC. I take you and your billion-dollar company with me." Noah walked slowly toward the island, stopping just opposite Blake. The physical contrast was stark. Blake was coiled, sweating, and panicked, while Noah stood with the terrifying stillness of a man who had already read the final page of the script. "You really think I spent the last 48 hours doing nothing while my wife wired you my money?" Noah asked, tilting his head slightly. He pulled his own sleek smartphone from his pocket and placed it face up on the marble. "The $1 million Kennedy just transferred didn't go to your crypto tumbler in the Caymans. It was routed into a mirrored honeypot account engineered by Pemberton Tech's cybersecurity division. The moment the funds hit the ledger, an automated trigger notified the FBI cyber division in San Francisco." Blake's jaw tightened, his hand dropping away from the knife block. Furthermore, Noah continued, his tone conversational but lethal, my head of security, a man who used to dismantle foreign intelligence networks, has been inside your personal servers since Sunday night. He bypassed your two-factor authentication. He scrubbed your AWS cloud backups. There is no automated email scheduled for midnight. There is no dead man switch. The only copy of that audio file left in existence is the physical flash drive currently sitting in your left breast pocket. Kennedy let out a choked, ragged gasp, sliding further down the counter until she was entirely sitting on the floor, her face buried in her hands. She was witnessing the total annihilation of her blackmailer, but the savior executing it was a ruthless monster she did not recognize. This was the CEO who crushed rival tech startups. This was the apex predator of Silicon Valley. You have a choice, Noah stated, staring directly into Blake's panicked eyes. You can hand me the drive, walk out that door, and disappear into the storm. I will give you a 6-hour head start before I forward the unredacted dossier of your extortion operations in Seattle and Austin to the authorities. Or you can refuse, and the 2 unmarked vehicles parked at the bottom of the canyon road will come up here right now. Blake stared at the glowing screen of Noah's phone, the reality of his absolute defeat settling heavily over him. The arrogance that had fueled him for months evaporated, leaving only the hollow shell of a con artist who had finally conned the wrong man. His hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small silver encrypted flash drive and placed it on the marble counter. Smart, Noah whispered. Now get out. Blake didn't say a word. He didn't look at Kennedy. He simply turned, grabbed his coat, and walked out into the torrential rain, the heavy oak door slamming shut behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. The threat to Pemberton Tech was neutralized. The predator was gone. But as Noah slowly picked up the silver flash drive and looked down at his wife, weeping on the kitchen floor, he knew the war was far from over. The empire was safe, but the home was already reduced to ashes. 2 weeks after the storm at Half Moon Bay, the Whitmore Capital acquisition was officially announced. Pemberton Tech's stock surged 14% in a single morning, securing Noah Taylor's legacy as one of the most formidable architects in Silicon Valley. The financial media called the merger a masterstroke of corporate strategy. But inside the sprawling, sunlit expanse of the Meridian penthouse, there was no celebration. The space felt less like a triumph and more like a beautifully curated mausoleum. Noah sat at the edge of the long, formal dining table. He was dressed in a simple white Oxford shirt, the sleeves rolled up, staring out at the panoramic view of the San Francisco skyline. The fog had rolled back in, wrapping the city in a soft, melancholic gray. On the polished oak surface in front of him rested a thick manila folder, brought over by Chris Baker an hour earlier. Kennedy emerged from the hallway. The effortless, terrifying perfection that had defined her existence was entirely gone. She wore an oversized beige sweater, her blonde hair tied back loosely, the dark circles under her eyes bruising her pale skin. She moved with the slow, fragile caution of someone navigating a minefield, pulling out the chair opposite him. The silence stretching between them was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. There was no more adrenaline, no more digital espionage, no more predators to outsmart. There was only the devastating wreckage of a 7-year lie. Noah reached forward and opened the folder. He slid the thick stack of legal documents across the smooth oak. The bold black lettering at the top was unambiguous. Marital settlement, agreement, and decree of dissolution. Chris made sure the terms are more than generous, Noah said, his voice quiet, stripped of the commanding authority he had wielded at the Coastal House. It was just an exhausted hollow sound. The secondary properties, the liquid assets we discussed. You won't have to worry about your future. And the non-disclosure agreement ensures the board never learns about Blake Storm. Your professional reputation remains intact. Kennedy stared at the pristine white pages. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling so violently she had to interlock her fingers to keep them still. Noah, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the word. I never wanted to destroy you. The isolation, the silence in this apartment while you were building the company, it slowly crushed me. I made a catastrophic mistake looking for a way to feel alive again, and I walked right into a trap. But I loved you. I did. Noah looked at her, searching his own chest for the blinding rage or the profound grief that had consumed him weeks ago. He found neither. The fire had burned out, leaving only cold ash. He understood the trap she had fallen into, but understanding a betrayal did not erase the permanent scar it left behind. She had surrendered their life to a stranger. "I know you were drowning, Kennedy," Noah replied softly, his gaze steady and unblinking. "But when you started sinking, you didn't reach for my hand. You reached for a ghost, and you nearly pulled everything I built down into the dark with you." He unclipped a heavy silver fountain pen from his shirt pocket and placed it gently on top of the documents. "Sign it." Kennedy slowly reached out, her fingers wrapping around the cool metal of the pen. She looked down at the signature line, the final barricade between her past and an entirely uncertain future. She did not look up again. A single heavy tear escaped her lashes, falling silently through the quiet air. It hit the thick parchment paper right beside her printed name, the moisture instantly blooming, blurring the sharp black ink into a gray smudge. She pressed the nib to the paper and signed her name, the scratching sound echoing loudly in the vast empty penthouse. Noah watched the tears continue to fall, staining the legal decree of their severed lives. He looked around the breathtaking silent room, at the priceless art and the panoramic view of the world they had conquered. "We built an empire, Kennedy," Noah whispered to the empty air between them. "But we forgot to build a home."